morning, everyone. Welcome to our Founders Day ODK Convocation. Please remain standing for the invocation, which will be given this morning by Professor Harlan Beckley, Director of the Shepherd Program, and Fletcher O.D. Thomas, Professor of Religion.
Let us pray. Almighty and beneficent God, we gather in celebration of the accomplishments of many and in gratitude for the multiple blessings in our lives that are ultimately thy gifts to all of us. We come in gratitude to those who mediate the blessings of your beneficence, for our founders and their successors who have sustained the founders' work, for the institution that sustains our calling and community, and especially for those whose leadership and example will be celebrated on this day. Grant them and their families satisfaction in their accomplishments and the courage to continue in their commitments. Even as we gather in celebration and thanksgiving, we confess our shortcomings and our narrow focus on our lives when other human beings are in great need, sometimes for the lack of our care. Help us to care more, serve better, and be instruments of thy justice, especially for the people of Haiti. As we intercede to meet some of the immediate needs of the people of Haiti, expand our vision to understand the roots of their current needs and their hope for a better future. Help us to understand better the long-term needs of disadvantaged persons in all nations, including our close neighbors. Grant us the forgiveness required for renewing our commitments and the courage and wisdom to enhance the spirit of justice and caring leadership and service that we hold up for special recognition on this day. May thy blessings sustain and inspire us in this hour and in the days to come. Amen. Please be seated.
Sit down, so that I can sit down.
Thank you, Chamber Singers, for that beautiful piece, Set Down Servant. Has the happy coincidence of serving as instructions to our audience as well. Thank you. We gather as a community each year at this time, the birthday of Robert E. Lee, by charge of the Board of Trustees, to remember the individual who so profoundly shaped the institution that now bears his name. The purpose of remembrance has appropriately broadened over time. It is now an occasion to recognize and celebrate Lee's most enduring legacy, leadership, and its centrality to the Washington and Lee mission, and not just leadership, but a particular kind of leadership, one with integrity, honor, and service to others as its defining qualities. We have other occasions at this time of the year to consider leadership and its challenges as we remember Martin Luther King Jr. and celebrate his legacy, as we witness an international response to the tragedy in Haiti, and as we will soon hear from our nation's president on the State of the Union during a time of economic uncertainty and conflict abroad. Behind me, to my right and to my left, are portraits of two individuals whose influence is felt each and every day on this campus. Though we look with understandable trepidation on the problems in our society today and ponder with concern the changes underway in our economy, in our political system, in our international relations, we look back upon the challenges they faced and take reassurance and inspiration from their courage in the face of even more troubling times. This Founders Day holds for us our usual tradition of recognizing several individuals chosen for membership in Omicron Delta Kappa, the National Leadership Honor Society founded here in 1914. It now has chapters or circles at over 300 colleges and universities across the country. The form of leadership we embrace at Washington and Lee springs from the character and virtue of those individuals who have left their imprint on us. ODK is an extension of our institutional values, influencing how leadership is understood not just here, but for nearly a century on college campuses throughout the country. I congratulate those honored today by their induction into ODK and express appreciation for fulfilling our highest values. Later in the program, we will turn our attention to recognizing these individuals and their accomplishments. I want also to take the occasion to make a special announcement related to ODK. We are in the final stages of arranging for the ODK national headquarters to move to Lexington, Virginia. The Society will soon take up residence in the old train station located across from Wilson Hall, with plans to acquire it outright in the future. We will welcome the Society back to the place of its origins nearly a century ago and look forward to working with them even more to directly shape the lives, the vision, and the aspirations of young men and women throughout the country. This afternoon, it is our privilege to have among us several of the people who helped make this possible. Steve Bassesi, the National ODK President, who currently also serves in his day job as Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of Richmond. Tom Goodell, the Executive Director of ODK, currently located in the other Lexington, Kentucky. Ken Taylor, the Associate Director of ODK. I suspect that during their time here, at least I hope, they will be meeting with real estate agents to determine their own residences in the time to come. And two of our own, Bill Johnston, the class of 1961, who currently serves ODK as president of their foundation, and Bill Latour, class of 1949, and his wife Louise. Bill is also a member of the ODK Foundation Board, and as we all well know, the son of Rupert Latour, one of the original founders of ODK. Bill Johnson and Bill Latour have, through their generosity and philanthropy, helped make this move to ODK very, very much a possibility in the very near future. I would ask each of them to stand so that we may thank them for their service. This Founders Day, though, holds much more in store for us. Not only will we recognize our ODK initiates, we also have the distinct honor and privilege of bestowing 2 honorary degrees, one to Lord Butler, Friend of the University, Distinguished Scholar, and Public Servant. The other to Gordon S. Wood, Pulitzer Prize-winning scholar of the founding period in the United States and professor at Brown University. Though we usually award honorary degrees at commencement, the Board of Trustees, upon the recommendation of the Advisory Committee, and with my endorsement, decided to take advantage of their presence here today to confer upon them the university's highest honor, and in so doing, reinforce the message of this Founders Day for our students to lead lives of accomplishment and intellectual integrity. I now recognize Provost June Aprilli, who will read the honorary degree citations.
Frederick Edward Robin Butler, Baron Butler of Brockwell, is a public servant who rose to the highest ranks of the British government. A distinguished educator, the former master of University College, Oxford, he is a longtime friend and professional associate of Washington and Lee University. A distinguished graduate of Oxford, Robin Butler earned 2 firsts at University College and was launched into a long, varied, and highly successful career in public service. Robin Butler served 5 prime ministers with distinction, as the private secretary to Edward Heath and Harold Wilson, as principal private secretary to Margaret Thatcher, and as cabinet secretary during the premierships of Thatcher, Major, and Blair. In 1998, when he retired, he was the head of the British Civil Service. That same year, he was made a life peer and a member of the House of Lords. In 2004, he chaired a panel examining the controversial intelligence leading up to the war in Iraq. The final document produced by that panel, still known as the Butler Report, was a balanced and critical review of one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of our time. A second career, this time in higher education, began when Lord Butler accepted appointment as Master of University College, where he served his alma mater with the same distinction with which he served the country. For many years, he and his wife, Jill, were gracious hosts to Washington and Lee students and faculty who studied at Oxford under the auspices of long-established exchanges between our 2 institutions. Lord Butler, accomplished student, dedicated public servant, advisor to prime ministers, senior statesman, administrator of University College, and friend to Washington and Lee, we are proud to confer upon you the Doctor of Humane Laws honoris causa.
Pretty much a done deal, but I have to make it official. Lord Butler, scholar, public servant, friend of the university, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees, I confer upon you the degree of Doctor of Laws of Washington and Lee University. Congratulations.
Gordon S. Wood is one of our nation's leading historians, an award-winning author, a lifelong educator, and a scholar who has given this generation new and powerful insights into the hearts and minds of the leading figures who created the American Republic. A nation such as ours that is built on ideas has a special need for intellectual historians like Gordon Wood. He has spent a distinguished career exploring and explaining the ideas upon which America was founded. His classic books, The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, and The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin, won prizes that bear the names Bancroft, John H. Dunning, Pulitzer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Julia Ward Howe. He has recently published a volume in the Oxford History of the United States, Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, and a collection of essays on members of the founding generation, Revolutionary Characters, What Made the Founders Different. What sets apart the work of Gordon Wood is a remarkable breadth of scholarship, an uncanny ability to bring the 18th century to life, an elegant use of the English language, and a remarkable insight into the origins and development of the ideas, risky at the time, that shaped the birth of the American democracy. His books and lectures take us to a different and difficult time, and never shy away from the complexities and contradictions, the fortunes and foibles, the idealism and ideologies that characterize the men and women who built a new nation and dreamed of a new world. A recent New York Times review of his latest work said it well. Quote, "On every page of this book, Wood's subtlety and erudition show. Grand in scope and a landmark achievement of scholarship, Empire of Liberty is a tour de force, the culmination of a lifetime of brilliant thinking and writing." Gordon S. Wood, Emeritus Professor of Brown University, graduate of Tufts University and Harvard University, Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, Washington and Lee University is proud to confer upon you the Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa.
Once again, just to make it official, Professor Wood, scholar of our nation's founding and its values. By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees, I confer upon you the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters of Washington and Lee University. Well, you have already heard about Professor Wood's illustrious career. By way of introduction to his remarks, I will add only my personal admiration for all of his works, all of which I own and all of which I hope he will dutifully sign for me before he ventures forth from Lexington. Please welcome Professor Wood to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here on your Founders Day at your illustrious university. Now, I want to talk briefly this morning about another founding, the founding of the country. But actually, the founding of the country is connected in many respects to the founding of this university, as I hope to make clear. Now, the founders of our country have a special significance for us Americans. Celebrating in the way we do this generation that fought the revolution and created the Constitution is peculiar to us. No other major nation, as far as I know, honors its past historical characters, especially characters who existed only 2 centuries ago, in quite the way we do. We want to know what Thomas Jefferson would think of affirmative action. It's the kinds of questions that I get asked. What would George Washington think of the invasion of Iraq? As far as I know, the British don't have to check in periodically with either of the 2 William Pitts of the 18th century to find out what Gordon Brown's government is doing. But we have a different relationship to these founders, this generation. We have a special need for these very authentic historical characters in the here and now. And I think it's an interesting question to ask why this should be so. Now, I think there are many reasons, some having to do with the with original intent and so on, but that's too limited. We have a larger reason, and I think the most important one is the American sense of identity. The identities of other nations, say being French or German, are lost in the mists of time and are usually taken for granted, which is why I think such nations are having greater problems with immigrants than we are. We have our immigration problem, but it pales into insignificance compared to the problems the European states are facing and will face over the coming century. The Arabs who have been living in France for at least 2 generations don't seem to be French in the minds of many Frenchmen. They're citizens, but they're not really French. They don't look French. We have a very different kind of society. The whole world is here in America, and we no longer have any ethnic base to our nationhood. We became a state before we were a nation, and in some respects we're still not a nation in the usual sense of the term. We were founded on a set of beliefs, and not, as were other nations, on a common ethnicity, on a common language or a common religion. Since we're not a nation in the traditional meaning of the term, in order to establish our nationhood, we have to reaffirm and reinforce periodically the values of the men who declared independence from Great Britain and formed the Constitution and the other institutions. Almost everything we believe, equality, liberty, constitutionalism, the aspirations of ordinary people, that they all come out of the Revolution, and so it's natural we would look back to this period to find out what it is to be an American. And I think as long as our republic exists, we will go back periodically to this founding. Now, they were an incomparable generation. I know what Tom Brokaw said about the greatest generation, but I think most people would agree that the founders were the greatest generation. Succeeding generations have been unable to look back at them without being overawed by the brilliance of their thought, the creativity of their politics, the sheer magnitude of their achievement. They were larger than life, it seems, giants in the earth, a forest of giant oaks, Lincoln called them. They seemed to possess intellectual and political capacities well beyond those that followed them. What were they like? What made them different? Now, great as they were certainly not demigods or superhuman individuals. They were very much the product of peculiar historical circumstances and a peculiar moment in time. Nor were they immune to the allures of interest that attracted most ordinary human beings. They wanted wealth and position, and often speculated heavily in order to realize those aims. And a few of them actually ended up in debtor's prison. They were not demigods, but they were not Democrats either, certainly not Democrats in any modern manner. They were never embarrassed by talk of elitism, and they never hid their sense of superiority to ordinary folk. But neither were they contemptuous of common people. In fact, they always believed that the people in general were the source of their authority. So we had a moment where we had a nice balance between, you might call, aristocratic and democratic values. But even in their own undemocratic time and circumstances, they were unusual, if not unique. As political leaders, they comprised a peculiar sort of elite, a self-created aristocracy, largely based on merit and talent, that was unlike the hereditary nobility that ruled 18th century English society. 18th century Britain remained under the authority of about 400 noble families, whose fabulous scale of landed wealth, political influence, and aristocratic grandeur was unmatched by anyone in North America. While Charles Carroll of Maryland, one of the wealthiest planters in the American South, was earning what Americans regarded as the enormous sum of 1,800 pounds a year, the Earl of Derby's vast estates were bringing in an annual income of over 40,000 pounds. Lord Rockingham's estate in Northumberland, his country house, was 650 feet long, longer than 2 football fields. Compare that, say, to Westover, William Byrd's mansion on the James here in Virginia, which is 90 feet long, and you get a sense of the difference of scale. By English standards, American aristocrats like Washington and Jefferson, even with their hundreds of slaves, remained minor gentry at best. And by the English measure of status, lawyers like Adams or Hamilton were even less distinguished. Gentlemen, no doubt, but nothing like the English nobility. The American revolutionary elite was thus very different from the English aristocracy. By its very difference, however, it was ideally suited to exploit the peculiar character of the 18th century Enlightenment. Now, the 18th century Anglo-American Enlightenment was preoccupied with politeness, which had a much broader meaning than it has for us. It meant much more than manners and decorum. It meant affability, sociability, cultivation. Indeed, politeness was considered to be the source of civility, which was soon replaced by the term civilization. Civilization implied a social process. Societies, it was assumed, moved through successive stages of historical development. The four-stage theory was created in the late 18th century. You move from hunter-gathering to herding to agriculture, and then the final stage was commerce. Began in rude simplicity and progressed through the refined complexity of civilization. And all nations could be located on this spectrum of social development. Since civilization was something that could be achieved, everything was enlisted in order to push back barbarism and ignorance and spread civility and refinement. All sorts of new organizations and instruments sprang up in the 18th century to spread light and knowledge among people. Learned societies, lending libraries, debating clubs, assembly rooms, reading groups, gentlemanly magazines, concerts, galleries, and museums. 18th century English speakers saw the beginning of culture as a public commodity, as something that was valuable, that gave status and could be acquired. In other words, the cultural world that we're familiar with today was born in this age of enlightenment. Now, at the center of this new civilized world was the idea of a gentleman. Defining a proper gentleman was a subject that fascinated the educated public of the 18th century English-speaking world. And writers from Richard Steele, Addison and Steele, to Jane Austen spent their lives struggling with what constituted a proper gentleman, the proper character of a gentleman. Indeed, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were still going at this problem in the last years of their lives in retirement, in their letters. For many in the 18th century, including the American revolutionaries, being a gentleman assumed a moral meaning that was far more important than its social significance. Pure monarchists might still define aristocracies exclusively by the pride of their families, the size of their estates, or the lavishness of their display, or the arrogance of their bearing. But others increasingly downplayed or ridiculed these characteristics. Think of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth Bennet is concerned that Mr. Darcy be a real gentleman. She knows he has 10,000 pounds a year coming in. He knows he has good blood behind him, Lady de Burgh. But is he a real gentleman? And she wants to find out. And that's what Jane Austen was obsessed with, all her novels. If you think of Mr. Knightley in Emma, that's what she's concerned with, finding new criteria for defining a gentleman. Now, this enlightened age emphasized new man-made criteria of aristocracy and gentility: politeness, grace, taste, learning, character, all the things that Elizabeth Bennet's looking for in her prospective husband. This was carried even to the point where titled peers like Lord Chesterfield liked to think that their exalted social position was due to talent and not to inheritance. Now, we should point out that in today's world, Lord Butler got into the House of Lords not by blood, but by sheer talent and merit. And the House of Lords today is a very different place from what it was 2 centuries ago. To be a gentleman, however, was to think and act like a gentleman, nothing more. An immensely radical belief with implications that few foresaw. It meant being reasonable, tolerant, honest, and virtuous. Being a gentleman was the prerequisite to becoming a political leader. It signified being cosmopolitan, standing on elevated ground in order to have a large view of human affairs, and being free of the prejudices, parochialism, and religious enthusiasm of the vulgar and the barbaric. It meant, in short, having all those characteristics that we today sum up in the idea of a liberal arts education. Indeed, the 18th century created the modern idea of a liberal arts education in the English-speaking world. Now, the age-old distinction between gentlemen and commoners had a vital meaning for the revolutionary generation that we today have totally lost. I mean, we put gentlemen on our restroom doors. But for them, it marked a horizontal cleavage that divided that social hierarchy into two unequal parts, almost as sharply as the distinction between officers and soldiers divided the Army. Indeed, the military division was related to the larger social one. We still talk about officers and gentlemen. Gentlemen who constitute about 5% of the society in this state, this colony, Virginia, or 10% in the North, were all those who were at the top of the social hierarchy, who were wealthy enough not to have to work, or at least not work with their hands, and because of their talents, leisure, independence, and social preeminence, these gentlemen had an obligation to serve the public. The American founders were aspiring gentlemen, and thus they shared these assumptions about work, politeness, and the obligations of public service. Indeed, they were primed to receive all these new enlightened ideas about civility, about gentility. They were men of high ambitions, yet of relatively modest origins, and this combination made achieved, rather than ascribed values, naturally appealing to them. Almost all the revolutionary leaders, even including the second and third ranks of leadership, were first-generation gentlemen. That is to say, almost all were the first in their families to attend college, to acquire a liberal arts education, and to display the new 18th century marks of an enlightened gentleman. Because of their peculiar circumstances, they in fact found those values more appealing than the English themselves did. The English were complacent, but the Americans were new to this achieved status. In this respect, they were like the Scots, who were members of another outlying, underdeveloped province in the greater British world. I want to compare these two peoples because they both had great moments of creativity at the end of the 18th century. Both of them were provincial peoples living on the edges of the metropolitan English world. Both societies lacked the presence of the great hereditary noble families that were at the ruling center of English political life. At the Act of Settlement in 1807, when Scotland and England came together to create Great Britain, the great Scottish nobles moved to London, where the action was. And it left Scotland in the control of minor gentry. In both places, you have this minor gentry dominance. Professional men or relatively small landowners who are anxious to have their status determined less by their ancestry or the size of their estates and more by their behavior or their learning. Both the Scots and the North Americans were acutely aware of the contrast between civilization and the nearby barbarism, in the Americans' case, of the Indians, and in the lower Scotland's case, of the Highland Scots, who were, in the minds of people in Edinburgh and Glasgow, fully as savage and barbaric as white Americans considered the Indians on our frontier. Both were keenly aware, because of this presence of savagery, as they defined it, were aware of the degrees of civilization and spent much time writing and reading essays on the stages of social progress. There are many commencement speeches on the eve of the Revolution entitled From Rudeness to Refinement. How does a society become civilized? And what is the fear, and always the fear of too much rudeness. They knew that they lived in a cruder and more simple society than the English, and that England was well along in the fourth and final stage of social development, commercial society, and consequently had much to offer them in the ways of politeness and refinement. Yet at the same time, both the Scots and the Americans knew only too well that the polite and sophisticated metropolitan center of the empire was steeped in luxury and corruption. England had sprawling, poverty-ridden cities, over-refined manners, gross inequalities of rank, complex divisions of labor, and widespread manufacturing of luxuries, all symptoms of an over-advanced social development and social decay. In other words, England was on the verge of dissolution. That was widely believed by Americans and many Scots as well. Provincials in Scotland and North America began to feel an acute ambivalence about being part of the British Empire. They were proud of their simple native provinces, proud of being a Virginian or a Scot, but keenly aware of the metropolitan center of civilization that was London. Both Americans and Scots thus had the unsettling sense of living in two cultures simultaneously, and I think that is the crucial point. Although this experience may have been unsettling, it was at the same time very stimulating and creative. Provincial creativity. To try to make this point, I might use the analogy of American novelists in the 20th century. Living in two cultures simultaneously. They was very disturbing to a number of writers, but also creative. Think of at the beginning of the century, 20th century, the Midwest, with Dreiser, Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis, a flourishing of writers coming out of Chicago or Minneapolis. And why should that be flourishing? I think it's because these men were experiencing their sense of Midwesterness, a real sense of regional identity, but at the same time they knew there was a larger world in New York or London. The same was true of Southerners. Faulkner, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, you know them. They acutely aware of being Southern, but also aware of another world, a non-Southern world beyond them, and so on. You have blacks, black culture, very strongly identified. People like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, acutely aware of black culture, but knowing there's a non-black, a white culture out there that they are participating in as well. And the conjunction of these two is disturbing but creative. And then there were Jews, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Malamud, you know, the outpouring of creativity from these people who are experiencing two worlds at the same time. And then, of course, the classic example are the Irish, who from Jonathan Swift on to James Joyce and right up to our own day, living in two worlds, reading English, experiencing English, part of the greater British world, but also acutely aware of being Irish. It's not in the DNA that they should have all these writers. What can explain it except, I think, this dual experience of living in two cultures simultaneously. And I think this helps explain why the Scots and the North Americans should become such remarkable places of enlightenment and intellectual ferment in the English-speaking world during the last part of the 18th century. Scots like David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, John Millar certainly matched, if they didn't exceed, the American founders in brilliance and creativity. These Scots literally created the modern social sciences, including this four-stage theory that I mentioned earlier. Living so close to what they regarded as savagery and barbarism, both the Scots and the North Americans felt compelled to think freshly about the meaning of being civilized. And in the process, they put a heightened emphasis on learned and acquired values at the expense of the traditional inherited values of blood and kinship. And if you read Gibbon's autobiography at Oxford, he said the Dons were all complacent, they were dull, they were confident, they didn't have to think freshly about anything because they were on top of the world. The result was that these Scots and North Americans enthusiastically adopted the new enlightened 18th century ideals of gentility. Preoccupied with their honor or their reputation, or in other words, the way they were represented and viewed by others, these revolutionary leaders inevitably became characters, self-fashioned performers in the theater of life. Nothing was more important to their conception of character than the capacity for virtue or the willingness to sacrifice one's private interests for the sake of the public good. Disinterestedness, was the most common term that they used as a synonym for this classical conception of virtue. Now, disinterested meant impartial, unselfish, and it was peculiar to that period. It didn't mean what it's now come to mean for most of us, uninterested. And if you look up in a modern dictionary, there'll be two definitions, one being impartial, standing above one's interests, and the other being not caring, uninterested. It's almost, we blurred the two that they kept separate. And it's almost as if we can't conceive of anybody being disinterested any longer. Everybody has an interest, and therefore the whole conception has lost much of its meaning. I think there are only two occupations left in the United States where we have any confidence of disinterested behavior. One, it's not university professors. I would say judges we still have some confidence that they're going to be impartial. They're not going to let their own emotions or their own passions or interests affect their judgment, although we've come to doubt that, as you know, from the contested hearings we have over appointment to judges. But there is one occupation, so we've lost some confidence even with judges, but I think there's one occupation left that we have the utmost confidence. Our whole world depends on it, that these men in this occupation be truly disinterested. I'm thinking of referees and umpires in our sporting events. the NBA, NFL, they would all collapse if we thought that these referees and umpires weren't trying to be truly disinterested. A kid growing up in Boston is a Boston Red Sox fan. He becomes an umpire, and he's umpiring a Yankees-Red Sox game. We just have confidence that he's going to rise above his emotional commitment. That's what they meant by disinterestedness, and we don't honor that word in the way they did to the same extent. Now, no one of these founders took this ideal of disinterestedness and talked about it, used that term more seriously than did George Washington. In December 1783, as you perhaps know, Washington surrendered his sword to the Congress and retired to Mount Vernon. Now, this action of giving up his military command and going back home electrified the world and really established his reputation. He did not win a lot of battles in the Revolution. It's this action that stunned the world. And George III said, is reputed to have said, if he does that, retires, he will be the greatest man in the world. Now, every military leader in modern history, including ancient history, think of Caesar, had expected political rewards commensurate with their military achievements. Cromwell, William of Orange, Marlborough, all had expected to have political office that would follow from their great victories on the battlefield, but not Washington. Here he is, retiring to Mount Vernon. Now, during his retirement in the winter of 1784-85, the Virginia Assembly presented George Washington with 150 shares in the James River and Potomac Canal Companies in recognition of his services to the state and the cause of canal building in the state. Washington agonized over what he should do. He's out of office, but nonetheless he's agonized. Even though he could at this point have used the money from the shares, he had a cash flow problem, he felt he could not accept them. He had emerged from the Revolution with a reputation for virtue and selflessness that he did not want to endanger. He's very self-conscious about his reputation. And that's another thing that we have false modesty now. He was not falsely modest. His acceptance of the shares, he said, might be considered in the same light as a pension and might compromise his reputation for virtue. Yet he believed passionately in what the canal companies were doing, and he had long dreamed of making a fortune from such canals. Moreover, he said, I do not want to show disrespect to the assembly or to appear ostentatiously disinterested, that's his term, by refusing this gift. Now, few decisions in his life, in his career, caused more distress than this one. He wrote to everyone he knew, to Jefferson, to Governor Patrick Henry, to William Grayson, to Benjamin Harrison, to George William Fairfax in England, to Nathaniel Greene, even to Lafayette in France. Every letter is almost the same, seeking the best information and advice on the disposition of the shares. How would this matter be viewed then by the eyes of the world, he asked. Would not his reputation for virtue be harmed? Would not accepting the shares deprive me of the principal thing which is laudable in my conduct? Those are the kinds of sentences he wrote to these correspondents. Now, the situation is almost laughable today, but it was not to Washington. He suffered real anguish. He didn't even have, as we say, conflict of interest. He wasn't holding public office. Now, Jefferson eventually found the key to his anxieties and told him that declining to accept the shares would only add to his reputation for disinterestedness. Thus, Washington took the shares and did not want to insult the assembly, but then he gave them away to this college, which was, I think at that point, was about $20,000, worth about $20,000, and which would be millions today, and it became your university. They adopted the name Washington as a result of that gift that came in the 1790s, as a result of that gift. So on this founding day, keep in mind that you have a special relationship to the founders of the country, especially to the man, George Washington, whom not just George III, but another celebrated Virginian, John Marshall, called the greatest man on earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wood, for that. That's a great story, as many of us know, but you tell it better than just about anyone, and we appreciate it very much. I should note as well that Lord Butler also has to earn his keep during his time here. Yesterday he gave, I'm told, a great talk over at the law school, and later on today at 4 o'clock over at Stackhouse, he'll be talking on the British and the Iraqi intelligence of just the last few years. So we encourage those of you who are free at that time to take part in that festivity as well. It is now my pleasure to introduce Andrea Lee Hannock. Andrea hails from Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and is a biochemistry major, a Dean's List student, a George Washington Honor and University Scholar, and treasurer of Alpha Epsilon Delta Pre-Med Honor Society. She volunteers regularly for the Rockbridge Area Free Clinic, is co-chair of the Literacy Campaign, and is a member of the Neighbors Service League and Kappa Alpha Theta Social Sorority. I believe she is headed to the Cleveland Clinic next year. At least she has that opportunity if she so chooses to go there, which is quite an accomplishment for someone with her career aspirations. Andrea, with appreciation for all that you have contributed to Washington and Lee during your time here, I welcome you to the podium so that you may conduct the ODK tapping ceremony. Andrea.
14. In order to honor students, faculty, alumni, and community members. Since its founding, the Alpha Circle has striven to recognize and cultivate diverse leadership. On this noteworthy day, our new initiates join over 300,000 who have been inducted across the country since ODK's founding. Our initiates have demonstrated outstanding leadership in scholarship, athletics, service, the arts, and mass communications. They continue ODK's legacy when they compassionately work in the campus kitchen, tirelessly perfect a performance in the Lenfest Center, unwaveringly support teammates on and off the field, or present a finely crafted argument during a mock trial. In a special way, we also welcome to the Alpha Circle today our honorary initiates. We have Mr. Leroy Atkins, a former Associate Dean of Students and Navy veteran, who now serves as a member of our development office. Mr. Jackson Kelly, a distinguished alumnus and Vice President of the Coca-Cola Company, who also serves on the board of the Atlanta Speech School. And Ms. Joan Robbins, who is a former registered nurse, established Stonewall Jackson Hospital's first ICU, and as a religious life leader, raised the financial resources for the new Hillel House for Jewish Life. These extraordinary new members exemplify the leadership valued by our ODK founders, who pointed to the illustrious examples of Generals Washington and Lee as standards of leadership for their society, as Dr. Wood so eloquently described. I am genuinely excited as I think about the potential demonstrated in the student initiates honored here today, and I am humbled by the accomplishments of Mr. Atkins, Mr. Kelly, and Ms. Robbins. Their triumphs inspire us all to continue to lead by word and admirable example. Remember, you are leaders not only when you have a concrete goal in mind, but also in day-to-day life, as you continue to represent the honor and demonstrate the strength of character that our Alpha Circle recognizes today by your initiation. Thank you for your tremendous contributions to our community. While each of you offers something unique, your contributions are similar in that they have a significant and positive impact. Washington and Lee benefits in immeasurable ways from your ability to lead others. The world beyond our campus will continue to benefit from the personal integrity and the strength of character that compels you to use your abilities for the greater good. Thank you. We will now recognize each of our initiates, and I invite them to the stage for the traditional tapping ceremony. I will begin today with our honorary initiates, and I will call each to the stage individually, so I ask that you please hold your applause until all have been introduced. Leroy Cole Atkins. Mr. Atkins, an alumnus of Washington and Lee, served in the Navy after graduating. He returned to his alma mater, where he served in the alumni office and as Associate Dean of Students for Greek Affairs during the early stages of fraternity renaissance. Active for many years in the local community, including service as a youth lacrosse coach, he now works in our development office with primary responsibility for stewardship and donor relations. Robert Jackson Kelly. Mr. Kelly distinguishes himself in his Atlanta community as the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, as a trustee for the National Health Museum, and as a board member for the Atlanta Speech School. He currently serves as a vice president of the Coca-Cola Company, working closely with its CEO and playing a key role in shaping the direction and strategy for this multinational company. Joan Nancy Robbins. Ms. Robbins' first career as a nurse led to the creation of the first intensive care unit at Stonewall Jackson Hospital. In 2001, she started her work with W&L, helping to support the Jewish community on campus. Later, she has spearheaded the fundraising program and program design for the university's new Hillel House, which, as anyone walking on campus knows, is quickly becoming a reality. It will be dedicated this September and become an important addition to Jewish life here on campus. As they return to their seats, please join me in congratulating our honorary initiates. We will now recognize our student initiates. I call your attention to the program, in which you will find a detailed listing of their many and varied accomplishments. It's a wonder that they sleep. I will begin by welcoming our student initiates from Washington and Lee's School of Law to the stage. Once again, please hold your applause until everybody has been introduced. Edward Stewart Crossland. Michael Preston Gardner. Jean Patrick Hamilton. Edward Benton Keatley. Andrew Aaron Spivak. Christopher Jordan Hartsfield. Brandon Hasbrook. Megan Elizabeth Monahan. Now for the student initiates from our undergraduate junior class. Please join us on stage as well. Creighton Thomas Allen. Stephanie Jean Brown. Devin Samiria Cooper. Catherine Elizabeth Donnelly. Michael Todd Kuntz. Emily Taylor Matthews. As our new initiates return to their seats, please join me in congratulating our excellent juniors and law students. We will now recognize our initiates from the undergraduate senior class. William Douglas Baker. Brandon Lee Barnes. Catherine Page Boyles. Natalie Ida Bunnell. Alexandra Kondo Caritas. Gustav Robert Kavanaugh. Samara Tanette Malia Francisco. Cale Garrett Grove. Caroline Louise Head. Grace Buckley McGee. Marquita Julia Robinson. Aprajita Singh. Catherine Brainard Sinks. Daniel Thomas Thornton. Kimber Lauren Wiggs. Once again, please join me in congratulating our new initiates as they return to their spots. And a final congratulations to all our ODK honorary and student initiates. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for your leadership as well. I hope as you were hearing those names, you were able to follow in the program and note not just the quality of leadership, but the versatility of leadership. And if you saw one of our initiates dash out the back, he actually was dashing back to join the chamber singers, who will be closing our ceremony in just a few minutes. But on behalf of the entire Washington and Lee community, I offer my warmest congratulations to all of the new initiates who exemplify the ODK ideals of leadership through service, obligation to others, and individual sacrifice. Take a moment to look upon the accomplishments of the honorary initiates. My good friends and colleagues, Buddy Atkins and Joan Robbins, and my fellow alumnus, Jackson Kelly. Note too the achievements of our honorary degree recipients, Lord Butler and Professor Wood. Take inspiration from them and set your sights high. We will be watching with great interest as you grow as leaders, as well as leaders in your professions and communities in the years to come. The ceremony will conclude with the voices of the chamber singers performing the Washington and Lee hymn. We are adjourned upon its completion. Thank you very much.